You pull into a parking lot at Charlotte Motor Speedway sometime in the 1980s. A guy takes your money, hands you a ticket, maybe nods, maybe smiles. You walk toward the grandstands. You never look back. You have no idea that the man who just took your $5 won 2 NASCAR championships. You have no idea that he holds the highest career winning percentage in the history of the sport, a number that nobody alive has come close to touching. You have no idea that the reason he is standing in a parking lot instead of being celebrated inside that building is because he once asked for health insurance. And you have no idea that the sport you are walking in to watch spent 30 years pretending he had simply decided to stop racing one day and go home. That is not retirement. That is erasure. And it happened in plain sight, over decades, and almost nobody talked about it. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the men and women who built professional motorsport and got nothing back from it. If you are someone who wants the real, unfiltered history behind the sport, the parts that the official press releases will never tell you, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Today we are talking about Julius Timothy Flock, two-time NASCAR champion, holder of the highest career winning percentage in the history of the sport at 21 wins per 100 starts, a figure that has stood since 1961 and that nobody in the modern era is even threatening. A man who once raced with a rhesus monkey strapped into the passenger seat and won. A man who stood up to the most powerful single figure in American motorsport history and asked, plainly and legally, for the same rights that every other professional athlete in the country already had. And a man who had his entire livelihood stripped from him for doing it. Here is the thing. The Tim Flock story is not really a racing story. It is an American labor story dressed up in a fire suit. It is a story about who builds something, who profits from it, and what happens when the people who built it ask for a fair share. And it is a story that the institution at the center of it has spent 60 years trying to keep in the footnote. To understand what happened to Tim Flock, you have to understand the world he came up in. NASCAR in the 1950s was not a sport in any modern sense of the word. It was a privately held company run out of Daytona Beach, Florida by a former gas station owner from Washington, D.C. named William Henry Getty France, Big Bill France. He had personally organized the founding meeting at the Streamline Hotel in Daytona in December of 1947. He had personally drafted the rule book. He had personally negotiated the early television arrangements when there were any to negotiate. And critically, he had personally decided that the men who drove the cars were not employees. They were independent contractors. That distinction was not a technicality. It was the entire legal foundation of how NASCAR maintained authority over the people who made its product. An employee can join a union. A contractor cannot, not under standard American labor law as it existed in that era. France had that architecture designed before Tim Flock ever won a race. The drivers themselves came almost entirely from one specific community. The Southeastern Bootlegger Network, centered in Atlanta, Georgia, and the surrounding counties. The men who hauled moonshine out of Dawson County and through the North Georgia foothills had built engines that could outrun federal revenue agents and had built the driving skills to match. When France needed names to put on a starting grid, he went to those men. The Flock family was those men. Tim Flock was the youngest of the racing children in a family of 7. His father Leaf had been a tightrope walker and a bicycle racer and a cab driver and the owner of the first automobile anyone in Fort Payne, Alabama had ever seen. He died in 1928 of Bright's disease. Tim was 4 years old. His mother Marty was left a widow at the beginning of the Great Depression with 7 children and no income. She moved the family to Atlanta in 1931 and took a job in a hosiery mill. The older children went to work for their uncle Leonard Williams, known on the streets of Atlanta as Peachtree Williams, who ran the most successful bootlegging operation in the city. Bob raced. Fonte became one of the original kings of southeastern stock car racing. Ethel raced anything she could get her hands on and would eventually become only the second woman in history to start a NASCAR Premier Series race. And Tim, the youngest, was forbidden from racing. His mother said no. His brothers promised her they would keep him out of a car. They kept that promise for almost no time at all. In 1947, they brought Tim along to North Wilkesboro to work the pit. A car owner named Bruce Thompson asked him to shake down a race car. He won the feature on his first try, 35 laps, first time he had ever sat in a race car, 23 years old. Some people take to things. Tim Flock took to this. Now here is what most people do not realize about Tim Flock's early career. The speed was obvious from the beginning. Everyone who watched him in those first years said the same thing that Richard Petty would eventually put into words decades later. You would look out there and see a dozen drivers running sideways, fighting the car, wrestling it around the dirt, and Tim would just be running. Clean lines, no drama, and he would win. The race would be over before the other guys figured out they had lost it. The gentleman, people called him. Which was a little ironic, given the family business. By 1948, Bill France had consolidated the various Southeastern racing series under the new NASCAR banner, and Tim was running the modified division. He finished second in the inaugural Modified Championship. In 1949, France created what he called the strictly stock division, the forerunner of what would become the Cup Series. The inaugural race was held on June 19 of that year at a 3/4-mile dirt track on Little Rock Road in Charlotte. Tim borrowed an Oldsmobile 88 from his newlywed neighbors, who almost certainly did not know what was about to happen to their car. He finished fifth. On July 10, all four of the racing flocks, Bob, Fonte, Ethel, and Tim, started the Daytona Beach race together. It remains the only time four siblings have ever competed in a NASCAR Premier Series event simultaneously. That record still stands. Nobody has touched it. In 1950, Tim won his first NASCAR Cup race at Charlotte and took the Modified Series championship. France stripped him of the modified title because he had competed in a non-NASCAR sanctioned race promoted by a young North Carolina car dealer named Bruton Smith. Hold that name. Bruton Smith is going to return to this story in a way that makes the whole thing feel almost mythological in its structure. The 1952 season was the first time everything came together at once. 8 wins, 4 poles, 25 top 10 finishes in 33 starts, all wins on dirt. He won the inaugural Motor City 250 at the Michigan State Fairgrounds, the first NASCAR race in history to pay a 5-figure purse. The championship came down to the last race at West Palm Beach on November 30th. Flock needed only to start. He did better than start. He led much of the race until lap 164 of 200 when his axle broke and the car flipped onto its roof. He won the championship by 106 points over Herb Thomas while sliding upside down through the Florida dirt. He was probably, he said afterward, the only driver who had ever won a championship while on his head. He was not wrong. Then came Jocko. In 1953, car owner Ted Chester walked into an Atlanta pet shop and bought a rhesus monkey. He told Tim he was going to put the monkey in the race car as a co-driver. Tim's first thought, by his own account, was that Ted had been hitting the jug too hard. The more he thought about it, the more he liked it. The monkey was named Jocko Flock. Custom helmet, tiny driver suit, harness in the passenger seat. There was a chain on the floorboard connected to a trapdoor in the firewall, designed so a driver could check right front tire wear during a race. 8 starts together. 1 victory, May 16, 1953, Hickory Speedway, over 26 other cars. The only NASCAR win in history with a monkey co-driver. The record books confirm it and nobody is threatening it. The Jocko story ended at Raleigh Speedway on May 30, 1953, during the inaugural Raleigh 300. Jocko slipped his harness mid-race. He pulled the chain that opened the trapdoor. A pebble flew through the opening and hit him in the head. He panicked and climbed directly onto Tim's head while Tim was running on a 1-mile paved track at full racing speed. Tim pitted, handed Jocko to the crew, and finished third. Jocko never recovered. He refused to eat. A veterinarian eventually had to put him down. Tim Flock, when children asked him about the monkey in later years, would tell them he had fired Jocko because Jocko could not learn to sign his autograph. This is where it gets really interesting, because 1955 is not just the best season of Tim Flock's career. It is arguably the best single season any stock car driver has ever produced in the history of the sport, when you account for the conditions under which it was run. Before the season began, a wealthy Wisconsin outboard motor magnate named Carl Kiekhaefer decided he was coming to NASCAR. Kiekhaefer ran the Mercury Outboard Company out of Cedarburg, Wisconsin. He was a fanatical engineer and an even more fanatical control freak. He called Buck Baker first. Baker said no. He called Herb Thomas. Thomas said no. He overheard Tim Flock telling someone at a race that if he had a good enough car, he would win another championship. Kiekhaefer hired him on the spot. The salary was $40,000 for the season. In today's money, roughly $474,000. By the standards of mid-1950s stock car racing, that was an absolute fortune. Most drivers were making maybe a few $100s a week. The car was a Chrysler C300. 331 cubic inch firepower Hemi V8, dual 4-barrel carburetors, factory rated at 300 horsepower. Exactly 1,725 of them were built for 1955. The hottest American production car money could buy that year. Now, you might be thinking, okay, good car, good driver, of course he won. But here is what Kiekhaefer brought that changed the sport permanently. He was the first non-automotive national sponsor in NASCAR, with Mercury Outboard branding on the door. He was the first to use enclosed box van transporters, when everyone else was towing cars on open trailers. He was the first to put his entire crew in matching uniforms. He hired a traveling weatherman. He required his drivers to fill out detailed setup sheets after every session. He broke in racing tires by putting 500 street miles on every set using company cars driven by office staff before any tire touched a racetrack. He chartered cargo planes to fly his cars and drivers between races held on the same weekend so they could compete in 2 events in 2 different states on 2 consecutive nights. He was the first to test motor oil for contamination using scientific equipment rather than guesswork. None of that infrastructure existed in NASCAR before Carl Kiekhaefer invented it. He also rented out entire 40-room motels and segregated the men on one side from the wives and girlfriends on the other so that no extracurricular activity could distract anyone the night before a race. He was, by unanimous agreement of everyone who ever worked for him, genuinely impossible. Tim Flock won 18 races in 1955. 18 poles, 32 top 5s in 39 starts. 11 of those wins came flag to flag, leading every single lap. The championship margin over Buck Baker was 1,508 points. That 18-win record stood until Richard Petty won 27 in 1967. He also won a sports car race at Raleigh driving a Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, the only sports car race NASCAR has ever sanctioned, and was named the sport's most popular driver. He was 31 years old and by any objective measure, he was the best stock car driver alive on planet Earth. He walked away from Kiekhaefer 13 months later. The official story was stomach ulcers and weight loss. The actual story was that Kiekhaefer had held him in the pits at a race while he was leading by 2 laps and let 2 teammates pass him. Buck Baker won that race. Tim Flock finished third. In Kiekhaefer's own home state of Wisconsin the following August, driving for Bill Stropp instead, Tim Flock won the inaugural International Stock Car Road Race at Road America in Elkhart Lake. He said afterward it was special to him to win that one up there. It was the last NASCAR Cup victory of his career. He did not know that yet. Here is the thing about Tim Flock between 1956 and 1961 that most histories glide past too quickly. This was not a man coasting. He drove for different owners across those seasons. He ran Bo Morgan Mercuries. He won the 1957 Daytona Beach convertible race. He started ninth in the inaugural Daytona 500 in 1959. He had 22 starts in 1960. The ulcer was real, the wear on his body from the Kieckhafer years was real, and he was pushing through it. He was 36 years old in 1960, and he was not done competing. He was simply waiting for the right situation. What he got instead was 1961. And to understand 1961, you have to understand Curtis Turner. Curtis Turner was the most charismatic stock car driver of his generation. A Virginia timber dealer and former bootlegger who had won 17 NASCAR races by 1959, flew his own twin-engine Aero Commander airplane to every race weekend, settled bar arguments with his hands, and made and lost more money before lunch than most drivers saw in a year. Turner was also, in 1959, the co-developer of a brand new mile-and-a-half superspeedway in Charlotte, North Carolina, alongside Bruton Smith. The same Bruton Smith who had cost Tim Flock the 1950 Modified Championship. The circle of this story keeps closing back on itself. Charlotte Motor Speedway was a financial catastrophe from the first shovel of dirt. They hit solid granite where they had expected soft earth. Cost overruns consumed every dollar they had raised and then kept going. By the time the track opened in May of 1960, it was $800,000 in debt. By late 1961, the debt had passed $1 million. Bruton Smith would lose everything and would not return to Charlotte in any meaningful way until 1975. Curtis Turner was drowning. In the summer of 1961, with the Charlotte track collapsing around him and creditors closing in from every direction, Turner did the one thing that no one in NASCAR had ever dared to do. He flew to Chicago and sat down with representatives of Jimmy Hoffa's Teamsters Union. He asked Hoffa for $850,000 to save the track. Hoffa would loan him the money on one condition. Turner had to organize the NASCAR drivers and mechanics into a Teamsters-affiliated union. The union was already being formed under the name the Federation of Professional Athletes. It was simultaneously trying to organize NBA basketball players and NFL football players. The Teamsters had decided professional athletes were going to be their next major front in American labor. Turner agreed to the terms. He brought in two men to help him build it. The first was Glenn Roberts, whom everyone in NASCAR called Fireball. The second was Tim Flock. Now, you might be thinking, why Tim Flock? Look, by 1961, Tim Flock was not the dominant competitive force he had been in 1955. He had not won since Road America in 1956. But he was respected. He was organized. And critically, Curtis Turner's daughter Margaret Sue Turner Wright said it plainly in later years. Tim Flock, she said, was the only one that stayed on with her daddy. Turner was the public face. Fireball Roberts was the famous name that gave it credibility. Tim Flock was the one who actually went around to the other drivers, knocked on doors, explained the situation, and signed them up. He was the field organizer. The Federation of Professional Athletes had a list of demands. Read them carefully because this is the part that matters most. A pension fund for retired drivers. Death benefits for the families of fatally injured drivers. Health insurance. A scholarship fund for children of deceased NASCAR members. A formal procedure for driver complaints to be heard. Improvements in on-track safety conditions. And 40% of each track's time trial admission revenue to be distributed among competitors, in addition to their race purses. That is the complete list. There is nothing on it that was unusual or radical in any other professional American sport in 1961. Major League Baseball had a Players Association since 1953. The NFL Players Association had been formed in 1956. The NBA Players Association since 1954. Every other professional athlete in America already had mechanisms for pensions, death benefits, and basic labor protections by the time Tim Flock was going door to door asking NASCAR drivers to sign a $10 membership card. The only thing radical about the FPA's demands was that they were being made in NASCAR, and Bill France Sr. was not going to allow it. On August 8, 1961, Curtis Turner went public. A majority of the drivers on the Grand National Circuit had signed applications and paid their $10 initiation dues, he announced. Every account at the time agreed the number represented a majority of the active field. Fireball Roberts had signed. Tim Flock had signed. Junior Johnson had signed. Ned Jarrett had signed. Buck Baker had signed. The next race was at Bowman Gray Stadium in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and France needed to move before the momentum carried any further. What happened next at Bowman Gray Stadium is the hinge point of Tim Flock's entire life. France gathered every driver he could reach. He stood in front of them, and he did not negotiate, and he did not ask questions. He told them in plain language that NASCAR was finished if the Teamsters came in. And then he said the sentence that ran in National Speed Sport News on August 16, 1961, word for word. No known Teamster members can compete in a NASCAR race, and if this isn't tough enough, I will use a pistol to enforce it. There was a second line that every historian of the period has documented through oral tradition. Before I have this union stuff shoved down my throat, France said, I will plow up my 2.5-mile track at Daytona Beach and plant corn in the infield. The man then went to work on his most valuable asset. He sent his chief lieutenant, Pat Purcell, a former carnival operator, to collect Fireball Roberts personally. Purcell drove Roberts from Winston-Salem across the Blue Ridge Mountains to Asheville, North Carolina. By the time the car arrived, Roberts had renounced his FPA membership. The drive has been known ever since among NASCAR historians as the Long Ride. Nobody who has ever written about this period has speculated too hard about exactly what was said during those hours in the car, but the destination was never in doubt. Roberts's public statement read like a prepared confession. He said the Teamster people had implied there might be injunctions and litigation that would disrupt all of racing. He said that if he did anything to hurt the least man in racing, he would have no part of it. He was reinstated immediately. Tim Flock and Curtis Turner refused to renounce. France suspended them both for life. The stated charge was conduct detrimental to auto racing. Neither man had broken a single racing rule. Neither man had cheated at any race. The actual offense, joining a union, was a completely legal act under the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. That did not matter. France was the rule book, and the rule book said what he needed it to say. Here is what most people don't realize about the moment that followed. Tim Flock and Curtis Turner did not simply accept the ban and walk away. They fought it. They tried to enter a NASCAR-sanctioned modified race in Roanoke, Virginia shortly after the suspension was issued. Track officials seized their NASCAR licenses on arrival and physically barred them from the property. So they did what you do when an institution bars you from competing in a market you have a right to participate in. They sued. The lawsuit was filed in September of 1961. Each man asked for $200,000 in punitive damages plus lost earnings. The legal theory was that the ban violated North Carolina's right-to-work laws, because both Flock and Turner had documented contracts to drive cars for testing purposes at $150 a day plus expenses, contracts that NASCAR had now voided by suspending their licenses without cause. NASCAR's defense leaned entirely on the legal architecture that Ed Otto had helped construct years earlier using a 1951 New York prizefighter case as precedent. Drivers were not employees. They were independent contractors. Independent contractors had no right of association under labor law. A circuit court judge threw the case out in early 1962. The drivers had no standing. The suspension held. What broke the Federation of Professional Athletes entirely was not the Roanoke incident, and it was not the failed lawsuit. It was Jimmy Hoffa himself. By late August of 1961, Robert Kennedy was running the United States Department of Justice, and Robert Kennedy hated Jimmy Hoffa with the focused intensity of a man who had made dismantling the Teamsters leadership a personal mission. The Kennedy administration's pursuit of Hoffa for organized crime corruption was consuming every dollar and every attorney the Teamsters organization had available. 4 Cincinnati Teamsters locals were defecting to the AFL-CIO that same month. Hoffa was personally flying around the country putting out labor fires in St. Louis and San Francisco. The FPA was a side project to a man fighting for institutional survival. The Teamsters quietly concluded that the FPA's structure violated Section 302 of the Taft-Hartley Act and abandoned it. The drivers were left without their backer, without their legal funding, and without their organizing framework. There is one detail from this period that only fully entered the public record in the last decade, and it is the detail that makes the whole story land differently when you hear it. John Cassidy was a young Justice Department attorney working under Robert Kennedy in 1961. He later went on to become the man who inducted Bill France Sr. into the NASCAR Hall of Fame in 2010. In 2015, for an official NASCAR publication, Cassidy said this on the record. Sr., he said, knew he was in the battle of his life. One way to win that battle was to attack Hoffa, whom France believed to be corrupt. What better place to go for help than the United States Department of Justice? It just so happened that France and Bobby Kennedy were on the same wavelength. The man who ran NASCAR had used a federal criminal investigation into his own driver's union backer as a strategic weapon in a labor dispute. The Hall of Fame that bears his family's name published that fact 54 years after it happened, in a piece that was not written as a criticism. It was written as a tribute. Curtis Turner was reinstated on July 30, 1965. He won the inaugural American 500 at Rockingham that October driving a Wood Brothers Ford. He died in a plane crash in Pennsylvania in 1970 with the Hoffa loan still on the books and never repaid. Tim Flock was technically reinstated in 1965 or 1966, depending on which source you trust. He never started another NASCAR race. He was 41 years old when the ban was lifted. The physical reflexes of his championship years were not coming back at 41. And more importantly, the France family was never going to put him in a competitive car. The reinstatement was a document. The freeze-out was permanent. Now, here is the analogy that I think makes this land. Imagine you are a professional basketball player in 1961. You win 2 championships. You have the highest scoring average in the history of the league. You are 31 years old and you are at the absolute peak of your abilities. Then you and a group of teammates ask for a pension and health insurance, the same things that NFL players and MLB players already have. And the league bans you for life. By the time the ban is lifted 4 years later, you are 37 years old. The game has moved on. No team will give you a real contract. So you end up selling concessions at the arena for 30 years, while fans walk past you with no idea who you are. That is not a hypothetical. That is what happened to Tim Flock. The arena was Charlotte Motor Speedway, the same track whose financial collapse had triggered the Teamsters loan, that had triggered the union drive, that had triggered his suspension. The geometry of this story is almost too perfect to be believed, except that it is entirely documented. Bruton Smith was gone from Charlotte by the time Tim Flock started working there. Humpy Wheeler would eventually become the face of the track. The door was open for Tim because someone at Charlotte knew what he was owed, even if the sport's official record pretended he had simply retired. He sold parking passes. He worked in corporate hospitality. He greeted fans at the gate. He did public relations. He did all of it, by every account from every person who worked alongside him, without visible bitterness. His wife Frances said the same thing for the rest of her life. He was always such a gentleman, she said. Tim was a great ambassador for racing. If somebody wrote Tim a letter, he would write them back. Think about that for a moment. The man the sport had erased was writing letters back to fans who reached out to him. While the sport spent 30 years describing his exit from competition as a retirement in every official document it produced, honorary inductions came slowly. The National Motorsports Press Association Hall of Fame in 1972. The State of Georgia Sports Hall of Fame the same year. The International Motorsports Hall of Fame at Talladega in 1991. The Charlotte Motor Speedway Court of Legends in 1994. The NASCAR 50 Greatest Drivers list in 1998, as part of the sport's 50th anniversary celebration. That last one came in the spring of 1998. By that point, Tim Flock was dying. The diagnosis was cancer. Liver and throat. He had no medical insurance. He had spent 37 years working hourly and salary jobs after the income from his professional racing career had been eliminated in 1961, and the safety net he had tried to build for drivers like himself in 1961 had never been constructed. The Federation of Professional Athletes had asked for health benefit. France had crushed the organization. 37 years later, Tim Flock was dying in a bed in Mecklenburg County with no coverage and no way to pay for treatment. On March 22, 1998, Darrell Waltrip qualified for the Transouth Financial 400 at Darlington in a white car painted with the number 300 on the door, a tribute to his hero Tim Flock. NASCAR told him to take the 3-digit number off before the green flag dropped because 3-digit numbers were no longer permitted under current Cup regulations. The number came off. The white car stayed. Waltrip raced anyway and donated his purse money to cover Tim Flock's medical bills. Dale Jarrett was leading at the halfway mark and donated his halfway bonus to Tim as well. Flock joined the post-race press conference by telephone from his bed 9 days before he died. He died on March 31, 1998. He was 73 years old. He was buried at Sunset Memory Gardens in Mint Hill, North Carolina. This is where it gets really interesting in the most uncomfortable possible way. The Federation of Professional Athletes had specifically asked in 1961 for pension funds, health insurance, death benefits, and scholarships for children of drivers who were hurt or killed in the course of their careers. France had crushed the organization before any of those things could be built. In 1998, not one of those benefits existed for NASCAR drivers. Tim Flock died without medical insurance from a sport that had built its institutional foundation in part on the platform his driving had created. The record he set in 1955 with 18 wins helped establish Daytona and Darlington and every track on the schedule as destinations worth attending. The championship trophies his wins had generated had been used for decades to promote NASCAR as a legitimate professional sport. And the man himself was selling parking passes and writing letters back to fans. The NASCAR Hall of Fame opened in Charlotte, North Carolina in 2010. 5 inductees were selected every year. 5 in 2010, 5 in 2011, 5 in 2012, 5 in 2013. Tim Flock, 2-time champion, holder of the highest career winning percentage in the history of the sport, was not among any of those classes. He was on the ballot. He was passed over. Again. And again. And again. And again. Now, you might be thinking, surely the record speaks for itself. Here is the thing. The record absolutely speaks for itself. 187 starts, 39 wins, 21 wins per 100 starts. Nobody in NASCAR history has come close to matching it. Not Richard Petty at 18.9%. Not David Pearson at 16.5%. Not Dale Earnhardt at 17.1%. Not Jeff Gordon at 16.7%. Tim Flock is alone at the absolute top of the all-time winning percentage list, and it is not a close race. He is above every name you can think of by a margin that should have made him unchallengeable on any Hall of Fame ballot. He was passed over 4 times. His 5th nomination, in May of 2013, finally succeeded. Class of 2014. 76% of ballots cast. He was the top vote-getter that year, ahead of Dale Jarrett, ahead of Maurice Petty, ahead of Jack Ingram. Fireball Roberts, the man who had taken the long ride and renounced his union membership in 1961, was inducted the same year on the same ballot. Frances Flock accepted the ring on her husband's behalf. Humpy Wheeler, the man who had become the face of Charlotte Motor Speedway, the track that had been Tim Flock's employer for 30 years, presented it. ESPN's reporting on the 2014 induction was the only mainstream American sports media account that said plainly what everyone in the room already knew. No other driver, they wrote, had ever had to leap this particular obstacle to reach the Hall of Fame. The subject was so sensitive that to this day, the official NASCAR press release describing Tim Flock as a member of the Hall of Fame induction class of 2014 uses the following language. He retired after the 1961 season. He did not retire after the 1961 season. He was banned for life by a man who then used a federal investigation into organized crime to help dismantle the union his driver had helped build. The word retired is doing a tremendous amount of work in that press release. It is carrying 60 years of institutional discomfort on its back and hoping you do not look too closely at how much weight it is bearing. Here is where I want to slow down for a second, because I think there is a version of this story that gets told as a simple villain and hero narrative, and I do not think that version is complete. Bill France Sr. built something remarkable. NASCAR in the early 1950s was genuinely precarious. There was no guarantee it would survive. France had organized it out of chaos, and he had protected it fiercely. His instinct that a Teamsters connection would give the federal government grounds to investigate and potentially destroy the organization was not entirely paranoid given the political environment of 1961. Robert Kennedy was coming for Hoffa and anyone connected to him. But protecting an institution does not require banning a two-time champion for asking for health insurance. Those are two separate things. The first is strategic judgment. The second is the abuse of personal power. France did both simultaneously, and the historical record is clear enough that you do not have to choose one reading over the other. You can credit him for building the sport and hold him fully accountable for what he did to Tim Flock and Curtis Turner at the same time. The drivers of that era had no recourse. No players' association. No arbitration process. No grievance mechanism. Nothing. The rule book was France and France was the rule book, and there was no appeal. That is exactly the condition the FPA had been formed to address, and France had destroyed the FPA to preserve that condition. The drivers who had signed membership cards and then renounced under pressure did not do so because they were coward. They did so because they understood precisely what France was capable of, and they had mortgages and families and no pension waiting for them if he cut them off. Tim Flock and Curtis Turner understood the same thing, and they refused anyway. That refusal cost Tim Flock the last decade of his competitive career, his professional income, and his health insurance in the final months of his life. The institution he had helped build put the word retired in the press release and called it settled. I want to bring this back to the parking lot one more time, because I think that image is the one that holds the whole story together. There is something almost biblical about it, honestly. A two-time champion, the man with the best winning percentage in the history of the sport, standing at the entrance to the racetrack for 30 years, handing out parking passes to fans who would then walk inside and watch a sport that had been built in part on his achievements, without any of them knowing who he was. Without any of them knowing that the reason he was in the parking lot instead of the VIP suite was because he had once tried to get a pension and health insurance for professional racing drivers. The track he worked at was Charlotte Motor Speedway. The track that Bruton Smith and Curtis Turner had tried to build with borrowed money. The track whose collapse had sent Turner to Chicago to sit down with Jimmy Hoffa. The track whose debt had created the conditions for the Union Drive that had cost Tim Flock his career. He ended up working at the physical location where the whole thing had started. For 30 years. and the fans walked past him every race weekend with no idea. Here is what most people don't realize about the final accounting. The Federation of Professional Athletes failed in 1961. It was defeated by a combination of France's threats, Purcell's persuasion, Hoffa's legal troubles, and the structural vulnerability of drivers who were classified as independent contractors rather than employees. But the things the FPA had asked for, the pension, the health benefits, the death benefits, the safety improvements, did not go away just because the organization failed. Those needs remained. Drivers kept getting hurt. Families kept losing their primary income. The conditions the FPA had documented in 1961 persisted for decades. The NASCAR Sprint Cup Series did not establish a formal pension program until the mid-1980s. Health benefits for drivers and crew members developed slowly over years of negotiation between team owners and track operators with no formal player representation mechanism in place. The safety improvements at tracks, the catch fences, the wall barriers, the infield care centers, came gradually and in many cases only after specific fatalities made them impossible to avoid any longer. The drivers of Tim Flock's generation had tried to accelerate all of that in 1961 and had been told to get back in the car or get out of the sport entirely. The math on Tim Flock across his competitive career is genuinely hard to look at without feeling the weight of what was taken. 187 starts, 39 wins, 21% winning percentage, 2 championships in 3 full seasons of serious effort. Never worse than third in points in any year, he ran a full schedule. 18 wins in a single season that stood as the record for 12 years. 1 championship won while literally upside down in a wrecked car. 1 victory with a rhesus monkey in the co-driver's seat. He was the most technically precise driver of his era. He had the best preparation behind him in 1955 under Carl Kiekhaefer, the man who invented the modern NASCAR team structure. He drove on dirt and pavement and rode courses and beach courses. He won under every condition the sport could throw at him. And then he asked for the same labor protections that a baseball player already had, and a man with a pistol took it all away from him. He spent 30 years writing letters back to fans who reached out to him. He spent 30 years selling parking passes at the track where the whole chain of events had begun. He died without medical insurance, 9 days after calling in to a post-race press conference from his bed to thank 2 drivers who had donated their prize money to cover his bills. The sport put the word retired in the press release. The Hall of Fame passed him over 4 times before the record became impossible to argue with any longer. Tim Flock did not retire after the 1961 season. Tim Flock was erased. And the institution that erased him eventually had to let him back in through the front door because 21 wins per 100 starts is a number that cannot be argued away forever, no matter how useful the word retired is when you are trying not to explain something. Julius Timothy Flock, 2-time NASCAR champion, holder of the highest career winning percentage in the history of the sport. The gentleman, the man who raced a monkey and won. The man who asked for health insurance and paid for it with his career. The man who wrote letters back to fans from a parking lot for 30 years. Now you know who he really was. If this story landed on you the way it landed on me the first time I went deep into it, leave a comment below with what part hit you hardest. Mine was the parking lot. It always goes back to the parking lot. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of history, because there are a dozen more stories like Tim Flock's buried in the record books of every motorsport series that has ever existed, and most of them are still waiting for someone to go find them. This has been Legacy Motoring. Drive safe.